If you drive through Cumberland Gap today, you pass through a tunnel carved in 1996. The road is smooth. The mountains are scenic. It takes 4 minutes. In 1877, the same crossing took 2 days on a road that Daniel Boone had blazed a century earlier and that no one had properly maintained since. The wilderness road between Cumberland Gap and Pineville, Kentucky, was 14 miles of rutted track through dense forest, along cliff edges, and over 3 creek crossings that flooded without warning. It was also, between 1877 and 1879, the most dangerous road in America, not because of its terrain, because of what lived underneath it, or at least, that's one theory. Junius Hall, the Louisville Courier-Journal correspondent who spent 6 months investigating the disappearances, proposed 4 different theories in his dispatches. He believed all of them and none of them. What he actually discovered beneath that road was stranger than any of his theories, and more human. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before Junius Hall ever set foot in Bell County, before he ever lit his lantern and crouched beneath a limestone ledge in the dark interior of a mountain, 7 people vanished on a 14-mile road in southeastern Kentucky. Not all at once, not in some single catastrophic event that could be blamed on weather, or bandits, or the simple brutality of the frontier. One at a time, every few months, with a patience and a consistency that made it worse, that transformed what might have been a series of unfortunate accidents into something that could only be described as a pattern. And patterns, as every reader of detective fiction and every experienced correspondent knows, are not accidents. Patterns are the fingerprints of intention. The road itself deserves description because the road is not merely the setting of this story. It is a character in its own right, and like all the best characters, it has a complicated past. The Wilderness Road, sometimes called Boone's Trace, sometimes called simply the Gap Road, had been worn into existence by tens of thousands of years of use before Daniel Boone ever walked it. The Cherokee called the gap in the mountains by a name that translates roughly as the Wind Door, a narrow notch where the Powell Mountain, the Cumberland Mountain, and the Stone Mountain converge, in a geological accident that left a passage through the Appalachians at an elevation of just under 1,800 feet. The Cherokee and the Shawnee used it for centuries as a crossing point for hunting expeditions and seasonal migrations. Buffalo used it before them. The trail through the gap was, by 1775, not a new road, but a very old one, worn down not by wheels, but by hooves and moccasins and the soft, patient pressure of generations. Boone's party widened it. The settlers who followed widened it further. Between 1775 and 1810, something like 300,000 people passed through Cumberland Gap on their way to Kentucky and beyond. An astonishing procession of humanity that transformed the road from a forest track into something resembling a thoroughfare. At its peak, the Wilderness Road was the busiest highway in America, west of the Appalachians. Taverns and way stations appeared along its length. Ferries operated at the creek crossings. A man with a gun and a sharp eye could make a reasonable living off the passing traffic by whatever means suited his temperament. But by 1840, it was already fading. The Great Migration to Kentucky had crested and receded. People were pushing further west, to Ohio, to Indiana, to Illinois, to the vast unfamiliar territories beyond the Mississippi. The railroad had bypassed the gap entirely, threading through Knoxville to the south and Lexington to the north, leaving the 14 miles between Cumberland Gap and Pineville in a peculiar kind of historical suspension. The road that had once carried the vanguard of American expansion now served a scattered population of farmers, miners, preachers, and peddlers who had simply never left. By 1877, the wilderness road between Cumberland Gap and Pineville looked the way that all things look when history moves past them and doesn't look back. The ruts were deep and unpredictable, carved by a century of wagon wheels, and then left to fill with rainwater and freeze and thaw and crack and deepen again. The bridges over the creek crossings had rotted and been replaced with fords, which is to say that the crossings were now simply places where the road went into the water, and, if the weather cooperated, came out again on the other side. The forest had reclaimed the cleared margins of the road. Trees grew in what had once been the yards of abandoned taverns. Chimneys stood in the middle of thickets with no walls around them, like fingers pointing at the sky. The way stations were gone. The ferries were gone. The commerce was gone. What remained was the road itself, stubborn and purposeful in the way that old roads always are, connecting 2 points on a map with a directness that newer and more comfortable routes could not be bothered to match. And beneath the road, beneath the limestone bedrock that the road had been worn into over a century of use, there were the caves. Bell County, Kentucky sits atop one of the most extensively caverned geological formations in the eastern United States. The Cumberland Plateau limestone, laid down 350 million years ago in a shallow tropical sea, has been dissolved by slightly acidic groundwater for the past 10 million years into a labyrinth of passages, chambers, and vertical shafts that would require years of exploration to fully map. Some of the caves are small, narrow crawlways that a determined man could push through for 30 feet before the rock closed in and stopped him. Others are vast. Gap Cave, known today as Cumberland Caverns, has passages that extend for more than a mile and chambers large enough to hold a congregation. Cudjoe's Cave, the subject of a popular 1864 novel by John Townsend Trowbridge, had been used as a saltpeter mine during the Civil War and was well known enough to be on tourist maps. But these were the famous caves, the named caves, the caves that the county knew about and had, in some fashion, domesticated. The unnamed caves, the ones that local families knew about but visitors didn't, the ones without novelists or tourist maps or established paths, numbered in the dozens along the 14-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road. They were part of the landscape in the way that a particularly useful tree stump is part of a landscape. Noticed, utilized, unremarkable. Farmers stored root vegetables in them because the temperature stayed constant at around 54 degrees year-round. Moonshiners used them because the constant temperature was ideal for fermentation and the darkness was ideal for privacy. Children played in them. Dogs chased foxes into them. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces had noted the larger ones in their survey reports and used them for everything from ammunition storage to field hospitals. This is the world that Solomon Reed wrote into in January of 1877. Reed was a peddler, which in the 1870s was a more specific and socially significant occupation than the word suggests today. A peddler in rural Appalachia was not merely a man who sold things from a bag. He was a connector, a circulator, a one-man postal and commercial network that linked isolated farmhouses to the wider economy. He carried needles and thread, patent medicines and almanacs, combs and small mirrors, cheap jewelry and expensive rumors. He knew the road the way a postman knows a neighborhood. Every house, every dog, every woman who would buy a hair ribbon without asking her husband's permission first. Reed had been working the stretch between Cumberland Gap and Pineville for 11 years. He knew every rock and rut of it. He knew the caves, though he had no particular interest in them, beyond their utility as shelter in a rainstorm. He left Cumberland Gap on the morning of January 14th, 1877, on a mule named Patience, which was, according to the accounts of those who knew him, an aspirational name rather than a descriptive one. His saddlebags were full. He had $37 in coin in his coat pocket, which he had earned selling goods to the military post at the Gap. He expected to reach Pineville in 2 days, with stops along the way to sell from his bags to the farmhouses that lined the road. He never arrived. Patience arrived in Pineville 3 days later, on January 17th, alone. The mule walked into town with her full saddlebags still strapped to her sides, $37 in coin still in the coat that was draped over the saddle, though Reed himself had been careful to keep his money on his person rather than on the animal. The mule was hungry and thirsty, but otherwise unharmed. She showed no signs of having been in a struggle, no cuts or abrasions that would suggest a fall or a fight. She had simply been walking, alone, for an indeterminate period of time. This alone would have been alarming, but it was what was tied to Patience's neck that made the men who found her step back and look at one another in silence. Someone had tied a strip of cloth to the mule's neck. The cloth was clean, not torn from Reed's clothing, not a piece of saddlebag canvas, but a specific kind of woven cloth, gray-brown in color, that no one in Pineville could immediately identify. More importantly, the cloth had been tied in a specific knot pattern. Not a simple knot, not an accidental configuration, but a deliberate, intricate series of loops and crossings that took the shape, to those who knew how to read it, of a territorial marker. It was an elderly Cherokee man named Sequatchie, who had lived his whole life in the mountains above the Gap and who came into Pineville occasionally to trade dried herbs, who identified the knot when he was shown it 3 weeks later. He looked at it for a long moment, turning the cloth in his hands, and then he set it down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of a man putting down something that has weight beyond its physical mass. "That says occupied territory," he said. "It says, this place is spoken for. Go around." He would not say who used such markings, or what tradition they came from, or when he had last seen one. He bought his herbs and left Pineville, and the knot behind him, and nobody saw him again that winter. The disappearance of Solomon Reed was reported to the county sheriff, a man named Hiram Bates, who had held the position for 12 years and who possessed, in roughly equal measure, practical competence and an absolute reluctance to venture into the mountains in January. He sent a deputy to walk the road as far as Reed's presumed stopping point, which the deputy estimated to be somewhere around the 7-mile mark based on the mule's condition and the last farm at which Reed had reportedly been seen. The deputy found nothing. The road gave up nothing. No body, no blood, no sign of struggle, no discarded goods from the saddlebags. The ground was frozen hard, which meant there were no clear tracks to follow. The deputy returned to Pineville and reported that the peddler had either wandered off the road voluntarily or had been taken by persons unknown, and that in either case, the trail was cold. The case of Solomon Reed was filed away in the county records and might have remained there, unconnected to anything, had Margaret and John Duncan not set out from Cumberland Gap 3 months later. The Duncans were not locals. They were a married couple from Harlan County, moving to Pineville, where John had secured work as a surveyor's assistant for a mining company that was beginning preliminary assessments of coal deposits in Bell County. This was, in 1877, the very earliest edge of the industrial wave that would, within 20 years, transform the entire Cumberland Plateau. But in April of that year, it was simply a man and his wife and their loaded wagon moving through the mountains to start a new life. They had a dog, a brown mixed-breed hound of no particular distinction, named Drum. They had a good wagon, a reliable team of horses, and a meal packed for the road, cold chicken and biscuits and a jar of canned peaches that Margaret had put up the previous autumn. It was an April afternoon, mild and clear, the sort of weather that makes the mountains seem benign and even welcoming, when the Duncans' wagon was found by a neighbor boy who had come down the road to fetch a wandering cow. The wagon was stopped in the middle of the road, not pulled to the side, not unhitched at a campsite, not positioned at one of the roadside springs where travelers typically stopped to water their animals, stopped in the middle of the road, blocking it entirely, as if whoever had been driving had simply let the reins fall from their hands. The horses were still in harness. They were standing quietly, which was unusual for horses left unattended on a road they didn't know. On the tailgate of the wagon, as if someone had set up a picnic on an impromptu table, there was a meal, half a chicken, partly eaten, 2 biscuits, one of which had a single bite taken from it, a jar of canned peaches, open, with 2 spoons set in it, 2 place settings, 2 tin plates, 2 tin cups, arranged facing each other. Both forks were still in the food, not set down carefully beside the plates, as one might set down a fork when finished eating, but still stuck into the chicken, as if the diners had simply stopped mid-bite and stood up and walked away from the table, which is, as far as anyone was able to determine, exactly what they had done. Drum the hound was found a mile up the road toward Pineville, sitting in the middle of the track with his ears flat against his skull and his tail tucked under him. He was unharmed, but terrified. He had his back to the direction of the wagon. The neighbor boy who found him tried to lead him back to the wagon, and the dog planted his feet and would not move. He would not move, regardless of coaxing or pulling. He seemed, to the boy's account, and to every adult account that followed, to be fundamentally unwilling to go back to the place where his owners had last been. Nobody ever determined what John and Margaret Duncan had seen, or heard, or been told between the moment they stopped eating and the moment they disappeared. Nobody ever found them. The horses were eventually led to a nearby farm and stabled there for the winter, and then, when no one came to claim them, sold. The wagon was pulled to the side of the road and left there until it rotted. Drum the hound was taken in by the neighbor boy's family, and lived, by all accounts, a long and comfortable life. But he never again went near the stretch of road where his owners had vanished. Even years later, when the boy, grown by then to a young man, tried to take him that way. The dog would stop a quarter-mile from the spot and lie down in the road and refuse to move. Dogs understand things we don't, or they remember things we can't afford to. The sheriff made another trip out to the road. He walked the area around the wagon carefully this time, looking for signs of foul play. Blood, disturbed ground, discarded clothing, the remains of a fire that might have been used to signal or to threaten. He found nothing. The ground around the wagon showed the prints of 2 people and a dog. The people's prints stopping abruptly about 30 feet from the road's edge at a rocky outcropping where the limestone pushed through the topsoil in a low shelf. Beyond the outcropping, the prints vanished on the stone. There was a narrow crack in the limestone shelf, 6 inches wide perhaps, but it was too small for a person to pass through. Or it looked too small. Sheriff Bates noted it in his report and moved on. 3 months later, in August of 1877, Corporal William Hess of the United States Army left the military post at Cumberland Gap on his regular mail run to the post at Barberville, a distance of roughly 40 miles that took him first through the 14 miles of the Wilderness Road and then north along better-maintained routes. Hess had made this run 17 times without incident. He was an experienced rider, unafraid of the road, and he carried a government-issued sidearm that he had never found occasion to use. His horse was a solid bay gelding named Government Issue, a name that suggests Hess had a dry sense of humor about his chosen profession. Government Issue arrived back at the Cumberland Gap post 22 hours after Corporal Hess had departed, with Hess's dispatch bag missing from the saddle and Hess himself nowhere to be found. The horse was in good condition, better condition in fact, than if he had completed the full run to Barberville and back, which suggested that whatever had happened to separate rider from horse had happened early in the journey, in the first few miles. A search party went out the next morning. They found Hess's personal effects arranged on a flat, table-sized limestone rock about 100 yards off the road, in a hollow below a limestone bluff. The arrangement was precise enough to stop the sergeant leading the search party in his tracks and make him remove his hat. Not out of reverence exactly, but out of the same instinct that makes people take their hats off in places where something solemn has occurred. Hess's pocket watch had been placed at the top of the row. Below it, his wallet, still containing $11 and a daguerreotype of a young woman. Below the wallet, his wedding ring, which he had been wearing on his left hand that morning, according to the soldier who had seen him off at the post. Below the ring, his Bible, a small format New Testament with his name written in the front cover in his own hand. The items were arranged in a neat horizontal line on the rock, separated by even spaces, as if someone had been careful to leave enough room between each item for them to be seen individually, as if each item were an exhibit in a case. His dispatch bag was never recovered. Whatever official correspondence it had contained was never delivered to Barberville. The Army conducted its own investigation, which concluded after 6 weeks that Corporal Hess had likely been robbed and murdered by persons unknown, and that his body had been disposed of in the forest or in one of the nearby caves. A reward of $50 was offered for information leading to his discovery. No one collected the reward. What the Army's investigation did not explain, what no one satisfactorily explained, was why a robber would steal a military dispatch bag and leave $11 in cash, or why a murderer would take the time to arrange his victim's personal effects in a careful line on a stone, like items in a museum display, rather than simply leave them where they fell. The arrangement spoke of deliberateness. It spoke of someone who wanted those items to be found and identified, who wanted it known that Hess had come this way, and that this way was the last place anyone should look for him. It was a message. The problem was that nobody could read it. The winter of 1878 brought the fourth incident, or rather, the fourth and fifth incidents, because this time there were two of them. Two unnamed travelers who stumbled out of the woods on a February morning and knocked on the door of a farmhouse 2 miles off the Wilderness Road, as if they had been walking for some time in a direction they couldn't fully account for. The farmer's wife, who opened the door, described them later to Dr. Elias Knott, the Pineville physician who examined them, as looking the way people look after church. Not quite here yet, still somewhere inside their heads. They were a man and a woman, not a couple by the look of them, more likely two strangers who had been traveling in the same direction and had fallen in together for safety. They were unharmed, physically, no cuts or bruises, no signs of exposure despite the February cold, no obvious illness. They were dressed in their own clothing, which was clean and dry. They were not hungry. They were, however, thoroughly incoherent, not in the way of people who have had a shock, not trembling, not weeping, not speaking in incomplete sentences. They were incoherent in a more specific, more unsettling way. They could carry on a conversation, answer questions, respond to their names, which not recorded as E. Hollis, male, approximately 40 years old, and A, or possibly O. Crane, female, approximately 35. They could eat and drink and dress themselves. They simply could not say with any consistency where they had been for the previous 24 hours. Hollis said he had been walking. When asked where he'd been walking, he said inside. When asked inside where, he said he didn't remember. When asked the last thing he did remember, before finding himself walking, he looked at his left hand and said, "Someone looked at my hand." Crane, examined separately, gave essentially the same account. She had been walking. She had been inside somewhere. She didn't remember the details. She remembered someone looking at her left hand. Dr. Knott examined both hands carefully. On each person's left hand, on the fleshy pad below the thumb, there was a small wound, a clean incision, perhaps 3/8 of an inch in length, that had been made with something sharp and that had been closed with a single neat stitch of fine thread. The wound was not fresh. It was 2 or 3 days old by Knott's estimate, well on its way to healing. It had been treated with something antiseptic, possibly turpentine or some herbal preparation, because there was no sign of infection. Knott noted in his records that the wounds were identical in both size and placement on both individuals, which suggested they had been made by the same hand with the same instrument. He noted that the stitching was competent, the work of someone with at least basic surgical training, or at minimum significant experience with wound closure. He noted that neither patient could explain the wounds or had any memory of receiving them. Both Hollis and Crane recovered fully within a week. Their memories did not return. They left Pineville and, as far as the historical record shows, never returned and never spoke publicly about their experience. Knott kept their names in his records and reported the incident to Sheriff Bates, who added it to his growing file on the disappearances along the Wilderness Road and stared at the file for a long moment before closing it and putting it in his desk drawer. By the time Reverend Lyle Combs walked into the road at midnight in March of 1879, the disappearances had become a local legend. The Wilderness Road, never an inviting stretch of travel, had acquired a reputation that went beyond the merely dangerous. People who lived within a few miles of it knew about the incidents, knew the names Reed and Duncan and Hess, knew about the two incoherent travelers who had wandered out of the woods, unable to say where they'd been. They spoke about these things the way that rural people speak about things they can't explain and don't want to think about too hard, obliquely, in hypotheticals, with the careful vagueness of people who suspect that naming a thing too precisely might invite it closer. Combs was not a stranger to the road. He had ridden it dozens of times in his 14 years as a circuit-riding preacher, serving the scattered congregations of Bell County. He was 61 years old, stout and deliberate, a man who had spent decades riding solitary miles through these mountains, and who had developed a preacher's equanimity in the face of wilderness, a sense that he was accompanied, that the darkness beyond his lantern was not empty, but full. He had no fear of the road. He had, in fact, written a small pamphlet for his congregation about the spiritual significance of the gap as a threshold, a passageway, a place where one world ended and another began. He left the small church at Yellow Creek on the evening of March 3rd, 1879, planning to make the crossing to Cumberland Gap by morning. He had done this ride 100 times. He knew every turn of the road. He was found at midnight by a farmer named Calvin Prewitt, who was coming home late from a neighbor's farm, sitting in the middle of the Wilderness Road, not collapsed, not injured, not unconscious, sitting in the middle of the road on a large flat stone in the lantern-lit dark, with his hands folded in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. Prewitt pulled his horse up and spoke to him. Combs looked up without surprise and said, with the air of a man making a perfectly ordinary observation, "I've been underground for 3 days." Prewitt pointed out, reasonably, that it was only shortly past midnight, and Combs had been expected to make the crossing by morning, meaning he had been gone, at most, 4 or 5 hours, not 3 days. Combs considered this carefully, the way a methodical man considers information that doesn't fit what he knows to be true. Then he said, "The time was different down there." He was not irrational. He was not delirious. His speech was clear, his bearing was calm, and his reasoning was, in its own way, internally consistent. He told Prewitt, and later told Dr. Knott, and later still told a reporter from the Middlesbrough Gazette, who happened to be passing through, that he had entered a cave, opening he had not previously known about, somewhere along the middle stretch of the road. He had been invited in by a person he described as a man, but dressed from a different time. Not old, but old-fashioned, the way that old portraits are old-fashioned. He had gone in because the invitation had been, somehow, irresistible. Not threatening, irresistible, like the way a story pulls you forward past the hour when you intended to sleep. Inside, he said, there were rooms, not natural cave chambers, but made rooms, walls built from limestone blocks, ceilings fitted with wooden beams where the cave ceiling was too irregular, furniture tables, chairs, shelves with objects on them, lamps burning something that smelled like tallow but gave a clean, even light, books on the shelves, a hearth with a fire in it. Other people, he couldn't say how many, who moved through the spaces with the ease of people in their own home. They spoke English, he said, but it was English from a different time. Not incomprehensible, he understood them well enough. But the rhythms were older, the vocabulary was older, the manner of address was older. They spoke the way that his grandfather's generation had spoken, or perhaps his great-grandfather's, the way that people spoke in books written 100 years before. They had fed him. They had not restrained him. They had talked to him about. And here Combs's account became less specific, more impressionistic, about things he couldn't quite bring himself to repeat. About the road. About the people who had passed over it. About what lay beneath it and had always lain beneath it and would continue to lie beneath it long after the road itself was gone. When he wanted to leave, he left. They had opened a passage for him, and he had walked back to the surface and found himself on the road in the middle of the night, with no clear sense of how long he had been below. He was committed to the Eastern Kentucky Lunatic Asylum in Lexington 3 weeks later, at the recommendation of Dr. Knott, who found him physically healthy, but mentally. Knott's word was reoriented, by which he meant that Combs seemed to be living, at least partially, in a different frame of reference than the one that most people shared. He continued to maintain his account with complete consistency. He never recanted, he never added to it, or elaborated in ways that suggested confabulation. He simply told the same story, in the same detail, every time anyone asked him, until he died in the asylum in 1884. He was never, by any official account, considered reliable. It was the cumulative weight of these 5 incidents. 7 people, 6 of them still missing, 1 found alive with an account that the authorities dismissed and the neighbors found terrifying, that eventually reached the desk of Henry Watterson, the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, in the spring of 1879. Watterson was one of the most significant figures in 19th century American journalism, a man who understood that the best newspaper stories were not about what happened, but about what it meant, and who had spent 2 decades assembling a staff of correspondents capable of writing at that level. He read the brief accounts that had been filed by local stringers, recognized the shape of something larger, and dispatched his best man. Junius Hall arrived in Pineville on a Thursday afternoon in early May of 1879, traveling by rail to Jellicoe, Tennessee, and then by horse the remaining distance north. He was 34 years old, a graduate of Transylvania University in Lexington, and a correspondent of 8 years' experience who had covered the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire, the same year, and more recently, a series of mine disasters in western Pennsylvania that had established him, among readers of the Courier-Journal, as a writer who could be trusted not only to find the story, but to understand it. He was also, which was less professionally significant, but personally essential, a man who found the darkness at the bottom of a cave more interesting than frightening. He had once, on a dare at a university fraternity dinner, crawled 600 feet into a cave in Woodford County in order to retrieve a piece of cave onyx that he had bet he could reach. He had retrieved it. he kept it on his desk as a paperweight. His first dispatch from Bell County, published 2 weeks after his arrival, opened with a line that became one of the more quoted sentences of his career. "The Wilderness Road has a history longer than the United States, and a patience that makes the United States seem like a recent and temporary arrangement." He had gone to Bell County expecting to find a local mystery, a community haunted by its own superstitions, a string of unrelated accidents knitted together by fear and isolation into a narrative that felt more significant than it was. What he found instead was something he had not expected, something that resisted his professional instinct to reduce and explain, something that required him to hold 4 contradictory theories simultaneously and acknowledge that he couldn't yet rule any of them out. His first week in the county was devoted to what he called, in his notes, establishing the landscape, walking the entire 14-mile stretch of road, stopping at every farmhouse within reasonable distance, and making a map. The map, which he reproduced in simplified form in his dispatches, was the first systematic document of the road's physical character in decades. He noted the creek crossings, the cliff sections, the abandoned structures, and he noted the caves. The count surprised him. He had expected a few, the famous ones: Gap Cave at the northern end of the stretch, Cudjoe's Cave a few miles south. What he found was something closer to a geological fact. The road was riddled with them. In 14 miles, walking the edges of the road and the ground to either side, Hall counted 23 cave entrances large enough for a person to enter upright. He suspected there were more, smaller ones, hidden by vegetation or collapsed to crawlways, that he had missed entirely. He began keeping notes on each one. Some were clearly in regular use. He could see the marks of recent entry, footprints, the scratched stone at the edges of entrances where lanterns had been set down or clothing had brushed against the rock. These were the farm family caves, the ones used for storage and distilling and shelter, domesticated by generations of use and known to everyone in the area. He visited several of them, talked to the families who used them, looked inside. What he found in those family caves was unremarkable and oddly touching: the domestic archaeology of rural poverty. Root vegetables in crates lined up in the constant cool, crocks of fermenting mash behind makeshift wooden screens, shelves carved directly into the limestone walls, holding jars of preserved food. In one cave belonging to a family named Asher, he found a child's drawing scratched into the cave wall, beside a small niche that held a stub of candle, a stick figure with what appeared to be wings, which the mother identified as an angel, that her daughter had scratched there the previous winter when the cave was being used as an impromptu shelter during a blizzard that had collapsed part of their roof. The family caves were alive with use and history, but there were other entrances, darker ones further from the road, in places where the terrain made casual access difficult, that had a different quality. Entrances that Hall would approach and then stand in front of for a long moment, peering into the dark before deciding whether to go in. Entrances that had no footprints near them, or footprints that went in and didn't seem to come back out. Entrances that made the back of his neck do the thing it does when you're alone in a forest, and you realize the birds have stopped singing. Old Man Messer helped him understand the distinction. Elias Messer was 79 years old, or said he was. Hall noted in his dispatch that Messer's age was impossible to verify, and that Messer himself seemed uncertain whether his birth date was 1799 or 1800, which he attributed philosophically to the fact that time moves different when you're not paying close attention to it. He had been born within 3 miles of the road and had never lived more than 5 miles from it at any point in his life. He had farmed and trapped and, during the Civil War, had done something he was vague about that apparently involved keeping the interior of a cave in darkness when certain people were looking for it. He had the manner of someone who had spent 60 years learning to observe without being observed, which is to say, he had the manner of everyone who lives in the deep mountains long enough. Messer was the one who told Hall about the long dark. He didn't use the phrase himself at first. He talked around it, the way that people talk around things they've been taught not to name directly, circling the subject from a respectful distance. He talked about the caves he knew, the family caves, the ones that people used. He talked about the caves that people knew about but didn't use, the ones that went too deep, or had bad air, or had water in the wrong places. And then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it, he said, "And then there's the one under the road." Hall said he felt something shift in the room when Messer said it. Not the room, something in himself. The small change in air pressure that a journalist feels when the real subject of the conversation has finally appeared. The long dark, Messer said, was what his grandfather's generation had called it, and what their grandparents' generation had called it before them. And what? He paused here, meaningfully. What he suspected, the people who'd been in the mountains before the white settlers had called it too, though in a different language and with a different word. It was a cave system that ran beneath the road, not alongside it, not near it, beneath it, for most of the road's 14-mile length. He described it as the backbone of the mountain, the hollow center of the ridge that the road ran along, a passage that connected dozens of smaller caves through a main trunk like a river connected tributaries. He had been in it once, when he was young. He had not gone back. When Hall asked why, Messer looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man choosing how honest to be with someone he has just met. And then he said something that Hall quoted directly in his dispatch, because it was the kind of thing you couldn't improve on by paraphrasing. There are places that have been used for so long by so many different kinds of people that the place itself stops being neutral. It holds what's been done in it, the way a piece of cloth holds the smell of smoke. I didn't go back because of what I felt the first time I went in. Something that had been happening there a long time before me and was going to keep happening a long time after. Hall asked him where the entrance was. Messer told him. And then he told him something else, that he shouldn't go alone, and that if he was going to go, he should find Buck Sizemore first. Buck Sizemore was not easy to find, which Hall later recognized as a quality that made him exactly the right guide for this particular investigation. He was in his late 30s or early 40s. His age was as uncertain as Messer's, though for different reasons. A lean, quiet man of the type that the mountains produced at intervals. People who moved through the landscape with a practiced invisibility that wasn't evasiveness exactly, but a kind of ecological adaptation. He had grown up, as far as Hall could determine, in a household somewhere along the road, though he now lived alone in a cabin about a mile south of the gap that he had built himself on a piece of land that didn't appear in any property record Hall could find. He made his living by hunting, trapping, and guiding the occasional hunting party of wealthy men from Lexington or Louisville who wanted to shoot deer in the mountains without going to the trouble of finding the mountains on their own. He knew the terrain within 20 miles of the gap in the way that a man knows his own house in the dark, by feel, by instinct, by the internal map that develops in people who walk the same ground for enough years. He was not unfriendly, but he was careful about what he said, and there was a quality to his caution that Hall, who had spent years learning to read the pauses and hesitations of interview subjects, recognized as something more specific than general reserve. Sizemore wasn't a private man by temperament. He was a man who was keeping something specific to himself. Hall hired him as a guide on the recommendation of Messer and 2 other local men, offering $3 a day plus meals, which was generous by the standards of the time, and which Sizemore accepted without negotiation, which itself struck Hall as slightly unusual. Men who knew their own value usually negotiated. Men who agreed to a first offer without comment were either uncertain of their worth or had a reason for wanting to be on the journey that had nothing to do with the money. They set out on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June, carrying 2 lanterns each, a coil of rope, chalk for marking passages, and enough food for 3 days. Hall also carried his notebooks and, unusually for him, a revolver. Not because he expected to shoot anyone, but because going into an unmapped cave system with a man he didn't entirely know, to investigate a mystery that had already produced 7 disappearances, seemed like a situation in which a revolver might eventually clarify things that conversation couldn't. The entrance to the long dark was, when Hall first saw it, not impressive. It was a gap in a limestone bluff about a quarter mile from the road, partially hidden by the way the bluff overhung it, so that from any angle except directly in front, it appeared to be simply a shadow on the rock face. The opening was perhaps 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough to enter in a crouch, not large enough to enter standing. The ground in front of it was clean stone, which meant there were no footprints. It looked, Hall wrote in his notes, like hundreds of other cave entrances in the county, distinguished from them only by the slightly electric quality of the air that came out of it. Cool and damp with the particular mineral smell of deep limestone, but with something else in it. Something Hall struggled to name, and finally called the smell of use. Sizemore stopped in front of the entrance and spent a full 2 minutes looking at it without speaking. Hall watched him and waited. He had learned, in years of interviewing people about things they were reluctant to discuss, that silence was a more productive tool than any question. Finally, Sizemore said, "You understand, if we go in there, things might happen that I can't control and can't predict." Hall said he understood. Sizemore said, "And you understand that what you find in there, what you decide to do with it, that's consequential, in ways that are bigger than a newspaper story." Hall said he understood that too. Sizemore looked at him for another moment with those careful dark eyes, and then he crouched down and went into the cave, and Hall followed him. The first section of the long dark was what Hall had expected from a cave of its size and location. A narrow passage that required them to move in a crouch for about 30 feet before it opened into a chamber large enough to stand in. Hall straightened up, held his lantern high, and looked around him. The chamber was roughly oval, perhaps 40 feet across and 20 feet high at its peak. The ceiling was hung with stalactites, not the spectacular formations of famous tourist caves like Mammoth or Luray, but the modest, honest formations of a working cave. White and gray columns, some of them so long and thin they looked like teeth, others broad and ridged, like the folds of a curtain. The floor was dry. The air smelled of minerals and cool water. In the lantern light, the limestone walls had a soft, almost pearlescent sheen, as if the rock were slightly translucent, as if the mountain were lit from within. Hall spent a moment simply looking at it, because he was not a man who was unmoved by beauty, and because the beauty of the cave was real and worth noting. Then he looked at the floor. The floor of the chamber was not natural, or rather, the limestone floor was natural, but what had been done to it was not. In the center of the chamber, a section of floor perhaps 10 feet across had been cleared and leveled, the natural irregularities of the stone filled in with packed clay and small flat rocks. Along one wall, there was a shallow depression carved into the limestone that had the dimensions and function of a fire pit. A wide, shallow bowl with a chimney crack above it that led upward into the rock, allowing smoke to escape. The chimney was blackened with old smoke. The fire pit had been used many times. Around the fire pit, scattered and half buried in the floor's accumulated debris of centuries, there were objects. Hall crouched down and began examining them with the methodical care of someone who has learned that context is everything in historical investigation. He found, in that first chamber, the following: 3 clay pipe stems, broken, of a style he recognized as common in the 18th century. The short, thick-walled style that Revolutionary War soldiers were typically issued, a musket ball, lead, approximately the size of a large marble. 4 bone buttons of the type used on military coats in the same period. A fragment of pottery in a style that was not European. Smooth red clay with a carved geometric pattern that Hall recognized from his university education as characteristic of Cherokee work. A shell gorget, a flat oval of marine shell with a hole drilled through the top for suspension, that was clearly very old and clearly of indigenous manufacture. And, on a natural shelf in the cave wall at roughly eye level, partially hidden behind a stalactite that had grown in front of it over the past several decades, a single object that did not belong among the centuries of accumulated artifact. A small leather wallet, worn and water-stained, with the initials SR stamped in faded gilt on the front. Hall opened it with hands that were, he noted in his dispatch with characteristic honesty, not entirely steady. Inside, a peddler's license issued by Bell County, Kentucky, dated 1875. The name on the license? Solomon Reed. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Sizemore, who had been watching him with the expression of a man whose private calculations have just produced an expected result, said, "You'll want to keep going." They kept going. The long dark's main passage extended from the first chamber in 2 directions, back toward the entrance and forward, deeper into the mountain. Sizemore led Hall into the forward passage without hesitation, which told Hall that he had been in it before, whatever he might or might not say about how recently. The passage was higher and wider than the entrance had suggested. In places, it was 20 feet wide and 15 feet tall. with the flat, smooth walls of a passage carved by an ancient underground river, rather than the jagged irregularity of a recent collapse. The floor showed evidence of channeling. A stone trough, laboriously carved into the limestone floor, ran along the right side of the passage for most of its length. Water moved through it slowly in the direction of the entrance, outward toward the gap in the bluff. Hall touched the channel wall. The stone was smooth and regular in a way that the natural limestone was not. Someone had cut this channel. Someone had spent considerable time and energy directing a natural water flow through a shaped stone conduit, which meant that whoever had created it had been thinking about the long-term management of a water supply. This was not the work of someone sheltering temporarily from a storm. This was infrastructure. The main passage connected to lateral chambers at irregular intervals, the way branches connect to a trunk. Some of these lateral chambers were small, 10 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and appeared to have been used for storage. In the lantern light, Hall could make out crates along the walls, some of them collapsed and rotted to nothing, others still intact. In an intact crate in one of the storage chambers, he found 47 glass jars of preserved food, some of them old and cloudy, their contents unidentifiable, others clearly recent, the lids still clean, the contents visible as vegetables and fruit. Alongside the jars, a leather sack containing approximately 8 pounds of dried beans. Another sack, this one canvas, containing cornmeal. Someone had been here recently, not years ago, recently, within the past few months, possibly within the past few weeks. Hall made note of this in his notebook, carefully, with the date and his own initials beside it, as he had been trained to make notes of potentially crucial evidence. Then he continued following Sizemore through the passage. The passage descended gradually as it moved deeper into the mountain. The floor changed from dry limestone to damp clay, and then, after 100 feet or so, back to dry limestone again. A geological rhythm that suggested the water table's influence was variable along this section. The air remained fresh, which meant there were ventilation connections to the surface that Hall couldn't see. A feature of large cave systems, as he understood from his earlier cave experience, that allowed air to circulate even in passages far from any entrance. At a rough estimate, pacing his steps and marking the walls at intervals with chalk, Hall calculated that they were traveling roughly parallel to the road above, perhaps 50 to 100 feet below the surface, following the same northeast-southwest orientation of the road itself. The mountain they were in was not, in geological terms, a solid mass. It was a layered structure, a compressed sandwich of limestone and shale and limestone again, with the cave system occupying a zone where the middle layers had dissolved away over millions of years. Above them, the road. Beneath them, the deepest passages, and here, in the middle layer, this long, improbable corridor that ran beneath it all. It was at this point, approximately 200 yards into the main passage, by Hall's chalk-mark count, that the passage opened into a chamber of an entirely different character than anything they had seen so far. The chamber was large. Hall estimated it at 70 feet by 40 feet, though the irregular shape made precise estimation difficult. The ceiling was 15 feet high on average, with a long, irregular crack running along its apex that admitted a thin line of daylight from somewhere above. Not enough to see by, but enough to tell you that the surface was not far overhead and that the mountain was not here entirely sealed. This was the natural skylight that would later appear in Hall's dispatches as one of the most striking details of his account. In the light of the crack and his 2 lanterns, Hall looked at the room and felt, he wrote later, the specific vertigo of a person who has just stepped through a door they did not know was there. Because the room was not a cave in the way that anything they had seen so far was a cave. The room had been made. The walls had been built out. The natural limestone surface of the cave walls had been extended inward with courses of cut stone, not mortar construction, but dry-laid limestone blocks fitted together with the precision of a mason who knew what he was doing and had done a great deal of it over a great many years. The result was a set of walls that were plumb and even, that followed the natural contour of the cave chamber, but regularized it, smoothed it, made it domestic. The floor had been paved with flat stone flags. The ceiling, where it was too irregular for comfort, had been leveled with wooden beams and boards. Along the left wall, a shelf carved directly into the stone, 12 feet long and 2 feet deep, holding objects that Hall moved toward as if pulled by gravity. Ceramic jugs, tin pots, a cast iron pan, wooden boxes of varying sizes. Along the right wall, a sleeping area. 3 wooden platform beds built against the stone, each with a straw-filled ticking mattress and a wool blanket folded at its foot. In the center of the room, a table, roughly made, the top a single slab of smoothed limestone supported by limestone pillar legs with 2 wooden chairs on either side. On the table, a tin cup. In the cup, the cold remains of coffee, or something that smelled like coffee. The cup was not old. The coffee was not old. It had been made within the past day, possibly within the past few hours. Hall turned to look at Sizemore. Sizemore was looking at the doorway. There was a doorway, cut into the dry-laid stone wall at the far end of the chamber, 3 feet wide and 6 feet high, framed with timbers, with an expression that Hall would later describe as the expression of a man who knows what he's looking at and wishes for a moment that he didn't. Hall said, "Someone lives here." Sizemore said. "Yes." Hall said, "Recently?" Sizemore said, "Yes." Hall said, "And you knew?" Sizemore didn't answer that directly. He walked to the far end of the chamber and stood in the doorway and looked through it for a long moment. Then he turned back to Hall and said, "What I know, I'll tell you. But I need you to understand that there are things I know that you'll want to use, and when you use them, people will get hurt. People I care about. So, I need you to decide, before I tell you, what kind of correspondent you're trying to be." It was, Hall wrote in his notebook that night, the most sophisticated challenge to journalistic ethics he had ever received, and the person delivering it was a man in a buckskin coat in a cave in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, who had almost certainly never heard the phrase journalistic ethics in his life. Hall sat down on one of the limestone chairs and said, "Tell me." What Sizemore told him over the next 2 hours, sitting in that cave room with the natural skylight threading its thin line of afternoon light across the stone floor, while Hall took notes as fast as he could write, was not exactly what Hall had expected, and not exactly what Hall had feared, and was in certain ways stranger than either. The cave community had no formal name. It had, over the course of its existence, called itself different things at different times: the underground men, the deep settlement, the ones below, and, In its earliest documented form, nothing at all, because the people who had first taken to living in the caves had not seen themselves as a community, but as a collection of individuals separately making the same desperate choice. Its origins, as near as Sizemore could trace them, were in the years following the American Revolution. The area around the Cumberland Gap had been, during the war, a chaotic and contested space, too far south to be truly within Patriot territory, too far north to be reliably within Loyalist territory, traversed by soldiers of both armies and by an unknown number of men who had deserted from both armies and were simply trying to stay alive in the mountains, while the war finished its business without them. Some of these deserters, Hall estimated, from Sizemore's account, perhaps a dozen at the Revolution's end, had found the cave system and recognized it for what it was: a place where a man could vanish from the world without dying, where the constant temperature and the hidden water supply and the darkness made survival possible for someone who had reasons not to be found. Some of them had stayed, not forever. Some eventually made their way south, or died, or emerged after the war's end and returned to whatever they'd left. But some had stayed long enough to begin modifying the caves, cutting the channels, laying the stone floors, building the walls, and among those who'd stayed long enough to do the work, a few had stayed longer still, and among those, a very few had simply never left. The Civil War had brought another wave. The Cumberland Gap region, as every student of that conflict knows, was one of its most consistently contested areas, changing hands multiple times, the subject of major Union and Confederate military operations, the scene of guerrilla activity that was, by any objective standard, as much banditry as warfare. When the war ended, many of the guerrillas who had operated out of the caves simply continued operating out of the caves. Some of them were wanted men, specifically wanted, with their names on lists in federal offices. Some were men who had committed acts during the war, on either side, that made the prospect of returning to civil society uncomfortable in ways that went beyond legal jeopardy. Some were men who had been in the caves for so long, had adapted so thoroughly to the underground life, that the surface world had come to seem foreign and threatening in the way that it seems foreign and threatening to anyone who has spent enough time without it. By 1877, Sizemore estimated, carefully, with appropriate hedging, that the community consisted of between 20 and 30 people. Not all of them lived entirely underground. Some lived partially below and partially above, maintaining surface lives of a kind, hunting, trading, occasionally interacting with the surface communities in ways that didn't reveal the full extent of their existence. They were, in a sense, bilingual. They spoke the surface world's language and could move through it when necessary, but they were not of it. They had books. They had tools. They had, as Reverend Combs had observed, a domestic completeness that belied the idea of feral or degraded existence. They were, by Sizemore's account, educated, or self-educated, which in the 19th century in rural Appalachia was not remarkably different from formal education. The ledger hall had not yet seen, but would. The one that kept names and dates from 1812 onward was evidence of a community that kept records, that maintained continuity across generations, that understood itself as having a history. They were not, Sizemore said, murderers. He said this with a slight defensive edge that told Hall there was something he was defending against, some internal counter-argument that he had been having with himself for a long time. The travelers who disappeared, he explained, had not been killed. They had been invited in. The invitation was not always transparent. The Cherokee warning sign on Solomon Reed's mule, the arrangement of Corporal Hess's possessions on the stone, the strange knot in the cloth. These were signals, not violence. Signals that the road was watched, that the space beneath it was occupied, that travelers who ventured too close to certain entrances might find themselves in conversation with people they hadn't expected to meet. What happened in those conversations varied. Some travelers, Reed among them, Sizemore believed, had chosen to stay, not coerced, not imprisoned, chosen. Reed had been a peddler for 11 years on a road that was slowly dying, selling diminishing amounts of goods to a diminishing population of isolated farmers. And when he was offered something else, an alternative, a community, a way out of the particular grinding loneliness of his life, he had taken it. The Duncans, John and Margaret, had stayed too. Sizemore said this with a quieter voice. They had been moving to a new life anyway, and the one they were offered underground had been, in ways he didn't fully explain, more compelling than the one they'd been moving toward on the surface. Corporal Hess had not stayed, but he had made a choice. His personal effects arranged on that stone were a message, but it was his message, left by his own hand, a deliberate resignation from the life above. He was still alive, Sizemore believed, living below, somewhere in the deeper sections of the cave system. He had been given the choice, and had taken it. The two incoherent travelers, Hollis and Crane, had been brought in, and then released, confused by the experience, their memories partially fogged by whatever had happened in the gap between going in and coming back out. Sizemore was vague about this, and Hall pressed him, and the explanation he offered was one that Hall clearly found unsatisfying. That some people, when they entered the cave community and were given the choice to stay or go, experienced a kind of temporal dislocation, not supernatural, Sizemore insisted, not a trick of magic, but something to do with the cave's particular microclimate, the constant temperature, and the unusual air chemistry of certain sections of the long dark that could affect perception of time in ways that even the community's own members found hard to explain. Reverend Combs had been given the fullest experience, had been shown the most, told the most, offered the most. He had declined and been released. His description of rooms furnished from a different time, of people who spoke English of an older variety. All of this was accurate, Sizemore said. Combs had simply been given less than the whole truth, because the community had judged him likely to return to the surface and talk, which he had, and they had calculated that a story about underground Victorian eccentrics was less dangerous to their survival than the truth about who they actually were and how long they had been there. Hall asked Sizemore directly, "Who are you to these people?" Sizemore was quiet for a long time. The thin line of daylight through the ceiling crack had dimmed as the afternoon moved toward evening. Their lanterns threw long shadows across the stone floor. "His cousin," he said finally. "James Sizemore, 12 years older than Buck." James had gone underground in 1863, after the Cumberland Gap changed hands for the 4th time, and James had done something on behalf of one of the armies that he had determined he could not live above ground with afterward. Buck had been a child when James left. He had grown up knowing his cousin was in the mountain, but not knowing what that meant. When he was 16, James had found him on the road one afternoon and taken him in and shown him, and Buck had made his own choice to stay above, to serve as a surface contact, to help the community in the ways that only someone who moved freely in both worlds could help. He sourced particular supplies. He managed certain interactions. He had, for 20 years, been the community's liaison to the surface, its caretaker, its early warning system. He had not expected Hall. He had not expected the Louisville Courier-Journal, and a correspondent of Hall's tenacity and skill. He had spent 2 weeks after Hall's arrival, watching him walk the road and interview the farmers, and he had decided, finally, that Hall was going to find the long dark one way or another. Messer would point him there eventually, or he would simply map his way to it, and that it was better to control the encounter than to let it happen without him. So he had agreed to guide him. And now he was sitting across a table of limestone in a community that had existed for a century below a road that most of the state had forgotten, and he was telling a newspaper correspondent from Louisville everything he knew. And he was doing it because he had run the calculation and determined that the alternative was worse. But there was a calculation on the other side too, and Hall ran it as he sat there in the lamplight with his notebook full of the most extraordinary story he had ever encountered in 8 years of covering disasters and wars and the casual cruelties of industrial civilization. If he published all of this, the location, the names, the nature of the community, the identities of the people who had stayed, the community would be finished. Federal marshals would come. The army would come. The sensation-seeking tourists of the newspaper age would come. The wanted men would be taken. The others would be scattered. The cave rooms would be emptied and sealed. 100 years of hidden, stubborn, improbable human life would be destroyed in a matter of weeks. And for what? For a newspaper story, however extraordinary. For the satisfaction of answering a question that had been asked, officially, by perhaps a dozen people, and unofficially, by the road itself. He asked Sizemore, "Did the people below know he was here?" Sizemore said they did. He said he had told them he was bringing Hall, and that they had not objected. They were curious, he said. They had been reading Hall's dispatches about the disappearances. Someone on the surface had been collecting the Courier-Journal for them, which Hall found both touching and slightly disconcerting. And they had found him, in Sizemore's word, fair. They wanted to be described fairly. They did not expect to be protected, but they wanted to be described as what they were, rather than as what the surface world would find it convenient to believe them to be. Hall said, "I need to meet them." Sizemore led him through the doorway. What lay beyond was not what Hall had expected, and he had expected, by that point, almost anything. The passage beyond the doorway extended another 100 yards, connecting to a series of chambers that were, in their careful domesticity, in the evidence of organized and sustained human effort they displayed, in the sheer improbable completeness of a life lived entirely underground. The most astonishing thing Hall had encountered in 34 years of living in the world. There were 6 chambers in the main occupied section, connected by passages that had been widened and squared where the natural rock was too narrow for comfortable passage. In one chamber, The community stored its food, a proper larder, with smoked meats hanging from wooden pegs driven into the limestone ceiling, root vegetables in bins, a row of ceramic crocks sealed with wax. In another, a workshop, tools arranged on wall-mounted racks, a wooden workbench with a vise bolted to it, materials for weaving and leatherwork and basic carpentry. In a third, what could only be described as a library, a long wall of wooden shelves holding perhaps 300 books and an equal number of bound periodicals. Hall ran his eyes along the spines. Fiction and history and technical manuals. A complete run of Harper's Weekly from 1868 to 1877. Newspapers, not just the Courier-Journal, but the Lexington Gazette, the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Middlesboro Gazette, current newspapers, most of them less than a month old. In the fourth chamber, the one that Hall later described with the greatest care in his dispatches, because it seemed to him to contain the most human truth of everything he had seen. A schoolroom, 4 wooden desks facing a wall on which a smooth section of cave rock had been painted black to serve as a chalkboard, a box of chalk, a shelf holding primer books and spellers and arithmetic texts. On the chalkboard, written in a careful hand, a multiplication table. There were children here. There had always been children here. Hall met 12 of the community's members over the course of the afternoon and evening he spent in those chambers. He did not meet all of them. Sizemore told him that several were in outer sections of the cave or had used the surface exits to go above for various reasons, and that the community had agreed to allow Hall's visit but not to require everyone's participation. The 12 he met ranged in age from approximately 14 to perhaps 70. They were, as Sizemore had told him, literate and articulate, and, in certain ways, the most thoroughly educated people he had encountered in Bell County, not better schooled, necessarily, than educated people elsewhere, but intensively, self-directedly educated in the way of people who have nothing but time and books and the motivation that comes from living in a place where knowledge is the primary currency. They spoke to him with a careful politeness that had the texture of having been discussed and agreed upon in advance. They answered his questions. They did not volunteer information beyond the questions. They were watchful in the way that people are watchful when they have spent their lives assessing whether the person in front of them is a danger, and they were, Hall thought, remarkably calm for people whose existence was in the hands of a stranger with a notebook. He asked them about the 7 disappearances. The answers he received were, collectively, a more nuanced version of what Sizemore had already told him. The community had not set out to recruit travelers. That was important, they said, and Hall believed them, or believed them to the extent that it was possible to verify. What had happened over the years was that people had found the cave system by accident, wandered off the road in fog or darkness, followed water sounds to an entrance, gone in seeking shelter, and had encountered the community in the organic way that one encounters something when one walks into it without expecting to. What was offered to them after that was a choice, genuine and uncoerced. They could stay. They could go. If they stayed, they became part of the community with all that entailed. If they went, they were guided to the surface and released without interference, though the community asked, and received in most cases, a promise of silence. Hall asked about the 2 travelers who had been released in a confused state, unable to account for their time. The answer was given by a woman of about 50 named. She paused before giving her name, the only time in the afternoon that the polished reserve cracked slightly. Marguerite. She said that some people, when they came into the cave, experienced a kind of sensory recalibration that lasted for a period after they returned to the surface. The constant temperature, the absence of daylight, the particular quality of the air in the deeper sections. These things affected the body's timekeeping in ways that the community had come to understand empirically, even if they couldn't explain them scientifically. It wasn't a drug. It wasn't a deliberate manipulation. It was the cave itself, doing what deep places do to the human body when the body has been there long enough. Combs, she said, had been in the deepest sections. He'd stayed longer than most visitors. The temporal disorientation he'd experienced was real, not imagined. 3 days of subjective experience in 6 hours of objective time. They had not intended it to happen to that degree. They had apologized to him, she said, with a dry precision that suggested she was still slightly annoyed about the whole affair. He had declined the apology and instead given a small sermon on the theme of divine providence, which he had found, in retrospect, oddly comforting. Hall sat in that underground library in the lantern light and wrote until his hand cramped. And then he wrote more. He was aware, in the part of his mind that was always aware of such things, that this was the greatest story he had ever found. He was also aware, with equal and competing force, that publishing it in the form it deserved would destroy the thing the story was about. He stayed 2 days in the cave system in total, sleeping on one of the community's beds with his notebook under his pillow and his revolver under the mattress, where it stayed and was not needed. He ate their food, dried venison, cornbread made in a cast-iron pan over a carefully managed fire, whose smoke was channeled through a natural crack system that functioned as a chimney, dried apple rings sweetened with wild honey. He talked to 12 people, whose names he wrote down, and then, in a second pass through his notes, struck out and replaced with letters. He examined their books and their records and their tools, and their carved water channels, and their black-painted chalkboard, with its multiplication table, and the small carved angels and animals that someone, a child, by the scale of the carving, had worked into the limestone wall beside the beds. On the second morning, he followed Buck Sizemore back through the long dark to the entrance, and they emerged into the late June sunlight, which felt violent after the cave's even dimness, and walked back to the road without speaking. Hall filed his dispatches to the Courier-Journal over the following 3 weeks, 5 in total, running on the front page of the Sunday edition. They were widely reproduced in newspapers across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. They were everything the story deserved in terms of vividness, detail, historical texture, and the quality of prose that made Hall's work worth reading even now, a century and a half later. They described the Wilderness Road and its history. They described each of the 7 disappearances in careful, unsparing detail. They described the cave system, its beauty, its extent, its layered evidence of centuries of use, in language that made readers feel the cool air and smell the minerals and see the lamplight on the pale stone. They did not give the location of the long dark. They named no names. They described the cave community in the third person, conditional. It is possible that somewhere beneath this road rather than as a confirmed and documented fact. Hall was a journalist who'd been taught that facts required verification, and that the proper standard of verification was not, "I was told," but "I can prove." He reported what he had seen as what he had seen, and what he had been told as what he had been told, and he made, in his final dispatch, a careful and transparent distinction between the two. The final dispatch was the one that people remembered longest and quoted most often in the decades that followed, not for its revelations, which were carefully hedged, but for its closing observation, which was not hedged at all. He had spent 6 months in Bell County, he wrote, and had walked the 14 miles of the wilderness road more times than he could accurately count, and had talked to everyone who would talk to him, and listened to the ones who wouldn't, and he had come to a conclusion that was not satisfying, and was not comfortable, but was, as far as he could determine, true. "I have told you what I found, and what I was told," he wrote. "These are not the same thing. The wilderness road keeps its secrets as it always has, not through silence, but through layers. Every answer I uncovered revealed a deeper question beneath it." He left Bell County in September of 1879. He returned to Louisville and filed his final expense report, and went back to covering the news of the day, which moved quickly and left no room for 7-month investigations into the secrets of 14-mile roads. He never returned to Bell County. He died in 1911, having covered 3 more wars and 2 more major disasters, at the age of 66, still working as a correspondent, still keeping in his desk a piece of cave onyx he had won on a bet 43 years earlier. His notebooks from the Bell County investigation, 5 notebooks, small format, filled with the close, precise handwriting of a man trained to get a great deal of information into a small space, were donated to the University of Kentucky Library by his widow in 1913. They were cataloged, filed, and, for most of the following 80 years, unread. But history has its own version of the long dark, its own deep passages through which the past moves slowly toward the surface. The notebooks were rediscovered by a graduate student in 1987 who recognized their significance and began transcribing them. The transcription project, which took 6 years and produced 4 academic papers, concluded in 1993. By then, a different kind of excavation was already underway in the mountains above. The Cumberland Gap Tunnel project began in 1991. The decision to build a tunnel had been made for the reasons that such decisions are always made. The old road over the top of the gap, US 25E, was inadequate for modern traffic. Narrow and steep and dangerous, particularly in winter. A tunnel through the mountain at a lower elevation would allow year-round travel at highway speeds, transforming the 4-minute scenic drive of modern experience from a 2-day journey on a rutted track, or rather, transforming what had remained in modified form of that journey. The project was funded, planned, surveyed. The boring machines were brought in. The mountain was entered from both ends simultaneously, the 2 bores advancing toward each other through the Cumberland Plateau limestone that had been slowly dissolving for 350 million years. On a morning in the early spring of 1994, a crew working on the Virginia side of the bore broke through a section of wall that the Geological Survey had mapped as solid limestone. It was not solid limestone. The chamber they broke into was approximately 30 feet by 20 feet, its ceiling 7 feet high. Tight quarters for tunnel boring equipment, but clearly not a natural cave formation. The walls were dry-laid limestone block, the courses still tight after an indeterminate number of years. The floor was paved with fitted stone flags. Along one wall, a shelf, wood, mostly rotted but structurally present in its outline, held in place by iron brackets rusted almost to dust, but still identifiable. The shelf held 3 books. 2 of them were immediately identifiable by their bindings, which were, despite deterioration, still legible. A Bible, the kind issued in large quantities during and after the Civil War, with the standard thick boards and the onion skin pages that have survived more than any other 19th century paper because of their particular manufacturing process. And John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress, published sometime in the mid-19th century in an American edition that was one of the most widely distributed books of its era. The third was a ledger, cloth-bound. The cloth deteriorated to a kind of soft gray fiber, the boards beneath still firm. The pages were legible. The foreman of the crew did what a responsible and curious person would do. He photographed everything. He took the photographs back to the project office and reported the find to the project manager, who reported it to the federal and state agencies with jurisdiction over archaeological finds in road construction projects. An archaeological team came and spent 4 days in the chamber, which was a tight enough space that the team worked in rotation, 3 people at a time. They photographed everything. They documented the construction of the walls. They examined the shelf and the books. They read, or tried to read, the ledger. The ledger contained names and dates. The earliest date was 1812. The latest was 1923. In between, an irregular series of entries, not daily journal entries, not financial records in any standard form, but something more like a census, a name, a date, sometimes a note of a few words. James Sizemore arrived October 1863 from Cumberland, by choice. Marianne Keaton, born here, January 1871. Thomas Allard, departed for the surface, spring 1882, reasons unknown. Solomon Reed arrived January 1877, taken by the Rhodes offer, remained. Margaret Duncan arrived April 1877 with husband John Duncan, stayed. William Hess arrived August 1877, left the army, chose to stay. The last entry was in a different hand from the preceding entries, younger, less practiced, with the slightly cramped quality of someone who had learned to write without a proper desk to write at. The date was April 1923. The entry read, "The last of us are going out. The road above has changed too much. The mountain cannot keep us anymore. We leave this book so that someone will know we were here." Underneath this entry, 11 names. No dates of departure. No notes. Just the names. The chamber, the archaeological team concluded, showed evidence of habitation spanning approximately 110 years. The dry-laid walls were constructed in at least 3 distinct phases, using techniques that evolved over the period in question. The water channel, present here too, running along the base of the right-hand wall, showed signs of repeated maintenance and modification. The overall conclusion of the team's report, published in an academic journal 2 years later and read by approximately 400 people, was that the chamber represented a previously undocumented instance of extended semi-permanent habitation in a cave system adjacent to a major historical thoroughfare, likely associated with communities of individuals who, for various social and legal reasons, chose to exist outside mainstream documentation from the early 19th century onward. The chamber was, the project engineers determined, geologically unstable, a determination that the archaeological team later noted, in private communications that were not published, seemed to have been made with unusual speed. The chamber was sealed with concrete. The tunnel boring continued. The project was completed in 1996. The ribbon was cut. The traffic flowed. The Cumberland Gap Tunnel is 1,670 feet long. It passes through the mountain at an elevation of 1,140 feet, far below the crest of the gap. Approximately 40 million pounds of limestone were excavated in its construction. It is lit by fluorescent lights and ventilated by industrial fans and maintained to federal highway standards. 4 million vehicles pass through it every year. 15 feet above the tunnel's ceiling, sealed behind 6 inches of concrete and inaccessible by any means that a casual visitor would think to employ, there is a room. In the room, 3 books. The room had held for approximately 110 years a community of people who had looked at the world above and chosen the world below, who had lived by the light of lamps in the constant temperature of the limestone, and read their newspapers, and taught their children their multiplication tables, and recorded their own existence in a ledger that they left behind, because they understood, as people who have spent a long time invisible understand, that to be witnessed is its own form of survival. The ledger is in a university archive somewhere. The tunnel is on Highway 25E. The road above the tunnel, the old road, the Wilderness Road, the road that Daniel Boone blazed and 300,000 settlers walked and 7 travelers disappeared from between the years 1877 and 1879, is now a hiking trail managed by the National Park Service. It is a pleasant walk. The forest has grown back over all of it. There is no sign of what the road once was, or what it once carried, or what once lived beneath it. The Cherokee had a word for a place where the world above and the world below are separated by only the thickness of a breath. A threshold place, a place where what is visible and what is invisible exist in permanent, uneasy adjacency. The old name for the gap in the mountain, the one that translates as the wind door, carries this meaning in its structure. Not just a passage through rock, but a passage between states of being, a place where ordinary rules of distance and boundary have been suspended by geology, or by something older than geology. Junius Hall, who was a practical man and a careful one, who believed in verification and evidence and the discipline of not writing what you can't prove, came close to this idea in his final dispatch without quite arriving at it. He wrote about layers. He wrote about answers that contained questions. He wrote about a road that kept its secrets, not through silence, but through depth, through the sheer accumulation of history that any place acquires when enough people have passed through it and left enough of themselves behind. He did not write about the wind door, but he might have, if he had known the word. The 4 million drivers who pass through the Cumberland Gap Tunnel every year are moving fast, and their minds are on their destinations. They don't know about the mountain they are inside. They don't know about the room above them, or the ledger, or the names in the ledger. Reed, Duncan, Hess, and 30 or 40 others spanning 110 years of chosen invisibility. They don't know about the knot tied to a mule's neck in January of 1877, or about the meal on a tailgate, with both forks still in the food, or about a preacher sitting calmly in the road at midnight saying that time moves differently in certain places underground. They don't know, and there is no particular reason why they should. The world above doesn't require you to know what's beneath it in order to cross it. That's always been the arrangement. The road and the long dark beneath it came to an accommodation on this point long before the tunnel was ever planned. But the tunnel opened that year. 4 million vehicles pass through it annually. None of their drivers know what lies 15 feet above them, sealed behind 6 inches of concrete and 200 years of questions. The mountain keeps its doors. The wind moves through them in both directions. And somewhere below the limestone, somewhere in the dark where the water runs through carved channels and the temperature never changes, and the silence is the silence of geological time rather than human absence. The record of 100 years of chosen invisibility waits behind concrete for the next correspondent with a lantern and a notebook and the professional stubbornness to follow the passage to its end. Junius Hall followed it as far as he could. He told you what he found